It's week 5 of the fantasy season, so you know exactly what we need to do. We're going to go through every single matchup, go over every single quarterback and tight end, and go over who you should be starting and who you should be sitting in week 5. All right, very quickly here, we have 4 teams on bye week here in week 5. The Pittsburgh Steelers, so no Aaron Rodgers. Johnny Smith, no Pat Freiermuth. The Chicago Bears, so no Caleb Williams, no Cole Kmet, Colson Loveland, whoever's left there at tight end. No Atlanta Falcons, so no Michael Penix, no Kyle Pitts. And then the Green Bay Packers, the last team on bye here, so no Jordan Love and no Tucker Kraft. Make sure you guys are checking your lineups and making adjustments accordingly. All right, let's kick the video off with Thursday Night Football. We'll have the Niners traveling to face the Rams. Let's go ahead and start with the Niners side of things. The Brock Purdy is questionable going into this Week 5 matchup, still dealing with that toe injury, but he was able to play in Week 4. It wasn't the best overall day for the Niners, but Brock Purdy was fine from a fantasy perspective, 22 of 38, 309 passing yards, did have 2 picks and a lost fumble, but still threw 2 touchdowns, 19.6 fantasy points. So if we were able to eliminate some of these turnovers, this would have been a very good day for Brock Purdy. So he's 18 or more fantasy points in every game he has played in thus far on the season. This Rams defense, they've been pretty good, top 10 against the quarterback position in terms of fantasy points allowed, but with all that being said, even on a short week, as long as Purdy plays, I still think he's a solid start. If it's Mac Jones, then I'll go ahead and skip Mac Jones. In terms of the tight end position, still going to get no George Kittle this week. So I know Jake Tongs has done some good stuff, and he did find the end zone this past week, but no way we can trust him from a fantasy perspective. So just go ahead and roll with Purdy. No other 49er in this matchup. Then moving to the Rams side of things, Matthew Stafford was very good last week, had his best fantasy day of the season so far, 27.4 fantasy points against the Colts, was 29 of 41, 375 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns. I mean, Stafford's going to have moments like this throughout the course of the season where he does kind of light it up, but it's a short week. The Niners are actually top 5 against the quarterback position on the season so far in terms of fantasy points allowed. So I think he's fine as a streaming option, but just bear in mind, 13.6, 18.3, 14.8, 27.4. Those are Matthew Stafford's fantasy stat lines on the year. Very up and down. The floor isn't exactly safe here, but I know some of you guys have quarterbacks on bye weeks here in week 5. So Stafford is a viable streaming option, but beware. Higbee, whoever's here at tight end, is not even worth talking about. They're not fantasy relevant. We can move on to the next matchup. All right, moving into Sunday's action, we're going to get an early morning matchup in London. The Vikings remaining overseas to face the Cleveland Browns. Carson Wentz was an okay streaming option last week, and I'm glad we had him as a streamer in the streaming video. But listen, okay, 23 fantasy points, 350 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, 30 of 46, 2 interceptions. The first half was much, much worse compared to the second half. I know it's a good stat line, a good fantasy stat line, but I'm still going to leave Carson Wentz as a sit this week against this Browns defense. They're top 12 against opposing quarterbacks on the season so far. I just don't feel good about this one. And once again, in terms of the bye weeks this week, I don't really feel like a lot of you guys are going to be reaching for quarterbacks on the waiver wire. It's basically, if you own Caleb Williams, maybe Jordan Love. So I just don't feel like you guys need to go out of your way to start Carson Wentz here in week 5 of the season. I know this is kind of close to a home game for the Vikings because they're already overseas, but they still have to travel from Dublin to London. So I'm just staying away from Carson Wentz. I don't think he's necessary in terms of the risk in your starting lineup. TJ Hawkinson, I'm just leaving as a start. I think you just kind of got to roll with the punches when it comes to Hawkinson. He has been better with Carson Wentz at quarterback with 7.9 or more fantasy points in each of the 2 starts with Wentz and at least 4 total receptions, 5 targets in both games. But listen, you just kind of roll with the punches here. I don't know if you're going to get a great floor or ceiling with Hawkinson this weno, but he is startable. It is a tough matchup. The Browns are also top 10 against opposing tight ends on the season. Then we look to the Browns offense here. There's nothing that we need to even consider. I mean, Flacco not going to be a start. There's probably a chance in the near future that Flacco's not even the starter here. 3.2 fantasy points in week 4 after having 4.6 fantasy points in week 3. He has 3 interceptions and a fumble, a lost fumble in the last 2 games. He has at least 1 interception or a lost fumble in every game this year so far. Just nothing from a fantasy perspective here. And yeah, when it comes to the tight ends, like, sure, you can always, throw a dart at the wall and roll one of these guys out there. But I think Harold Fannin, David Njoku, I've said it for a few weeks now, like the split here amongst these guys, the volume is just not good from a fantasy perspective. So I'm not starting either Fannin or Njoku as we move into week 5 of the season. Moving into the early window for Sunday's action, we'll have the Cowboys traveling to face the Jets. Dak Prescott, a big week 4 on Sunday Night Football against the Packers. 31 of 40, 319 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns, no turnovers, 30.9 fantasy points. I think you should feel good about Dak as a solid start once again here in week 5 against a Jets defense that is bottom 12 against opposing quarterbacks on the season so far. Good spot for him. Looks like even without CeeDee Lamb, that this passing offense and the overall offense for the Cowboys is going to be just fine. So I like a lot of the Cowboys offensive starters. Prescott, a very strong start here in week 5. And we loved Jake Ferguson last week. He was in the nuclear video. He was in the early morning video on Sunday as a must-start player. He had 17 fantasy points, 7 targets, caught all 7 of them, 40 receiving yards, and a touchdown, 16.8 or more fantasy points in 3 straight games. The tight end 1 in full PPR, the tight end 8.5 PPR. You got to keep rolling with him if you own him, regardless of matchup. But once again, this is not a Jets defense that scares me whatsoever. They just gave up 2 touchdowns to Darren Waller. So I love Ferguson this week. Very strong start. Then we look to Justin Fields. I think he's a really strong start this week. The Cowboys have given up the most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. This defense is absolute Swiss cheese. They give up a ton of fantasy points across the board. Listen, Fields, there's always risk that he's going to have one of those dud games. He still had a lost fumble this past week, but he had a rushing touchdown, 81 yards on the ground, 3 for 226 passing yards, and a passing touchdown. And then there was that other, touchdown to Garrett Wilson that maybe should have counted. Nonetheless, you got to feel good. He has 27 or more fantasy points and 2 of his 3 starts on the season. The other start, we just won't talk about it, but this is a good spot for him. The Jets are at home. You got to feel really good if you got to roll with Justin Fields this week. He's a strong start. Mason Taylor did show up this past week for the first time this season, had 11.5 fantasy points, 7 targets, 5 catches, 65 receiving yards. Once again, this is not particularly a bad matchup or anything, but I'm just not going to risk Mason Taylor. We got to see a lot more of these types of starts before we can even begin to consider him in fantasy. Moving along, we will have the Giants traveling to face the Saints. I will say, I think this could be a decent matchup. Both the defenses here are pretty bad, but let's go ahead and take a look at what potential we're going to have at quarterback and tight end. Now, Jackson Dart's going into the week questionable, dealing with a hamstring injury to come out for a very short period in last week's win against the Chargers. So if we do see Russell Wilson this week, I guess Russ is streamable if you're desperate, but nothing more than that. In terms of Jackson Dart, I do like him in this matchup against the Saints, who are a bottom 5 team against opposing quarterbacks in terms of fantasy points allowed on the season. So as long as he plays, I think he's a really strong streaming option. 19 fantasy points in week 4. The reason I can't put him above a streaming option is because most of it was done through the ground. He only threw 111 total passing yards, threw 1 passing touchdown, 54 yards on the ground, and 1 rushing touchdown. Had a fumble, wasn't a lost fumble. Still a very good, impressive first NFL start against a good Chargers defense. So I like him on the road here against the Saints if you guys need a quarterback to stream. And as long as he plays, I think Jackson Dart to throw a passing touchdown is a pretty good line on Underdog. His passing touchdowns are currently sitting at 0.5. So as long as he throws 1 passing touchdown, you'll hit that line. So I would head straight to Underdog. Take the over on Jackson Dart's total passing touchdowns. Don't forget, all new users who sign up on Underdog using promo code THECATCH are getting a free NFL Pick Em to use towards Week 5 NFL action. Take that free Pick Em. Take Jackson Dart to throw a passing touchdown in Week 5. If both of those lines hit, you'll automatically double your cash entry. And on top of that, Underdog has a brand new exclusive offer to all users who sign up using promo code THECATCH. Once you play through $5 on Underdog, you're going to receive $50 in bonus cash to use towards Week 5 NFL action. And on top of that, they're also going to give you a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So make sure you guys sign up using promo code THECATCH on Underdog if you want to take advantage of all of their Week 5 exclusive NFL offers. Theo Johnson was good last week, scored a touchdown. I mean, he's one of these tight ends you can always pop up. We want to pay attention to this potential chemistry between Dart and Johnson, especially with Malik Neighbors out for the year, but I'm not ready to call Theo Johnson a start just yet, but definitely a player worth paying attention to. Then we look to the Saints. I mean, Spencer Rattler, he's been better than advertised going into the year, but he still has not done enough from a fantasy perspective whatsoever for us to consider him. It's a good matchup against the Giants, but yeah, once again, we're not really in an extreme desperation territory for streaming quarterbacks this week, even with the bye week. So Spencer Rattler remains a sit for me. Jawan Johnson remains a start. I know this wasn't a good game last week for him against the Bills, just 5.8 fantasy points, but this happens at the tight end position. We see fluctuation even with good tight ends. Still a top 10 tight end in both full and half PPR. The Giants are middle of the pack against tight ends, one of their better points on defense, but I think if you own Jawan Johnson, just keep rolling with the punches. He's still a good start here in Week 5. Next up, we have the Raiders traveling to face the Colts. So let's start with Geno Smith and company. Geno, 3 interceptions this past week. Did throw 2 touchdowns, only threw 117 passing yards against the Bears of all teams. I mean, this was a great spot for Geno to be a solid streamer this past week after he had 26 fantasy points in week 3, no interceptions and 3 passing touchdowns. But first of all, the run game for the Raiders just completely took over against the Bears. So there was that aspect, and at the same time, you just never know what in the world you're going to get with Geno Smith. So I think he's streamable. The Colts defense, nothing to sneeze at, but they come in 19th against opposing quarterbacks. So if you're in a bad spot, Geno Smith always has the capacity to be a streamer, but move with much caution and risk when it comes to Geno Smith. Now, I do want to talk about Brock Bowers because he's had 8.8, 9.8, and 9.6 fantasy points in his last 3 starts. No more than 5 catches in a single game this year. And like week 1, that was fine. He had over 100 receiving yards. He hasn't had more than 46 receiving yards in the last 3 games. With that being said, he had 46 receiving yards this past week, and he led the whole team in receiving yardage. So I think I got to leave him as a start. Colts, middle of the pack against tight ends. I'm starting to get a little worried about the overall upside for Brock Bowers, and this is why I will never spend an early round draft selection on a tight end, but that's besides the point here. If you guys own him, once again, he's in that kind of category of like you just kind of got to roll with the punches, and if we get another game or two where he's like under 10 fantasy points, then maybe we'll have a different discussion, but for now, I say just keep rolling with him. I don't really know what other option, like maybe you have a Kincaid or a Ferguson, like someone like that. Like maybe you consider them over Bowers, but ultimately for most of you guys, you probably just keep rolling with Bowers. When it comes to Michael Mayer, he was actually out this past week and isn't really going to be someone we're considering anyways, so we can just move on. And then we look to Danny Dimes and company. It is time to talk about Daniel Jones as well. Just 12.3 fantasy points this past week. It's not an awful matchup as the Raiders are still bottom 12, against opposing quarterbacks. But yeah, there's kind of this idea of like Daniel Jones just going to be a solid starter no matter what. And I talked a lot about this strength of schedule for the Colts and quarterbacks all the way back to like week 1, right? Like at some point this magic could start to wear down, and Daniel Jones is certainly still playing very good, and the Colts are still, overall having success, even coming off of, a week 4 loss. Still a good outing by them, losing just 27-20, but still, like Daniel Jones going to have moments where he's still going to be streamable. Like I said, it's not an awful matchup by any stretch here against the Raiders. The Colts are at home, so if you need to stream him, that's fine, but Daniel Jones is not like just a for sure must-start quarterback on a weekly basis, and we're kind of missing some of that, red zone touchdown availability from Daniel Jones that we got through the first 2 weeks of the season as well. So don't want to harp too much on Jones, but I don't think he's really above the streaming category, even with those, first 2 weeks of the season, all that magic that we got and that kind of high upside that we got as well. Then we looked at Tyler Ward. He remains in the start category. Once again, he's one of these guys, like if you own Tyler Ward and you're just rolling with them and you're taking what you get, but he had his best fantasy day yet in week 4, 18.3 fantasy points, 6 targets, 5 catches, 70 receiving yards. Really, regardless of matchup, I would feel good here. Raiders are technically top 5 against opposing tight ends, but yeah, regardless of matchup, if I own Tyler Warren, I am still rolling with him with confidence here in week 5. All right, next up, we will have the Dolphins traveling to face the Panthers in what is probably the least anticipated game of week 5. Let's go ahead and start with Tua Tagovailoa, who remains a sit for me. Like, I keep wanting to believe that Tua might have some streaming capacity, but he's thrown 2 touchdowns in 3 straight games and has had 19 or less fantasy points in each game. Like, for around the 19 mark, that's one thing, but he's thrown 177 or less passing yards in 2 straight games. Yet, like, there's just not enough here to consider him in fantasy. Gets the Panthers this week, and believe it or not, the Panthers are a top 5 team against opposing quarterbacks in terms of fantasy points allowed. So, just staying away from Tua, and I don't think you guys really need to consider him, even if you're in a tough week, like due to the bye weeks. But yeah, I don't think it's that bad that you need to go get Tua off the waivers. When it comes to Darren Waller, I'm going to put him in the streaming category because why not? I mean, he had 17 fantasy points in week 4, but move with a lot of caution here. He only had 3 catches. Just turned out that 2 of those catches were touchdowns, but he gets the Panthers. This is a really bad team against opposing tight ends, so it's a good matchup. So maybe some of this Darren Waller stuff carries over into week 5. If you need a streaming tight end, sure, but like I said, move with caution. Maybe the riskiest streaming tight end on this video. Bryce Young, 10 fantasy points in week 4. He has 11.6 or less fantasy points in 3 of his starts this year. There's just no way that you can trust him. It's not even a bad matchup. It is arguably one of the best matchups you could have, right? This is a team that's given up the second most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks in the Dolphins. It's a home game for the Panthers. Maybe there's some sneaky upside here for Bryce Young. I just don't care to find out in my starting lineup or your guys' starting lineup, so I'm staying far away. All right, Ja'Tavion Sanders missed week 4. Uncertain if he's going to play in week 5 yet. It doesn't matter here. I mean, Tommy Tremble found the end zone this past week for what it's worth, so his name should be on the screen, but once again, I'm just not starting any tight end for the Panthers. It is a good matchup. Somebody could score here, but I'm not going to try and risk it and find out in my starting lineup or your starting lineup here in week 5. Next up, we got a good one between the Broncos traveling to face the Eagles. Let's start with Bo Nix and company. A big day in week 4 for Bo Nix, as expected, against the Cincinnati Bengals. 29 of 42, 326 passing yards, 2 passing tutties, a rushing tutty, and 1 interception. I think you keep rolling with Bo Nix against the Eagles this week. I know this matchup is going to scare a lot of people off, but the Eagles are kind of middle of the pack against opposing quarterbacks. It's certainly not the best matchup, but certainly not the worst. And I think this is going to be a game where the Broncos are forced to throw the football, kind of like we saw with the Buccaneers last week and the Rams the week before that. So I still think Bo Nix is solid. Maybe the ceiling is a little bit lower, but I still think he is a solid start here as we approach the week. Evan Engram, we saw a little bit more involvement this past week. Did have 7 targets, but just 4 catches. Adam Trotman, literally almost 0 involvement this past week, but still came up with 2 catches. So there's just nothing here from a fantasy perspective when it comes to these Broncos tight ends, unfortunately. But I guess we could keep our eyes on Evan Engram. Then we look to the Eagles side of things. I think you just always start Jalen Hurts. You guys know that's kind of my mentality, but bear in mind, the Broncos have given up the fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks on the season thus far, although this past week against Jake Browning kind of boosted that overall ranking. But yeah, the Eagles are at home here. I roll with Jalen Hurts if I own him, no matter what. I don't bench him, so that's what I would encourage you guys to do. I think Dallas Goedert's just straight up in the start category at this point. The volume is low. He only has 5 catches over the past 2 weeks, but 3 of those catches went for touchdowns. He has 10 or more fantasy points in every game he's played in this year. I think you just keep rolling with him if you own him. I think he belongs in the start category, but once again, bear in mind, it is a tough matchup. Eagles are at home, but the Broncos come in top 6 against opposing tight ends in terms of fantasy points allowed. So bear that in mind, but I do think that Goddard should be a solid start in week 5. Next up, we'll have the Texans traveling to face the Ravens. Let's start with the Texans side of things. I was somewhat tempted to put CJ Stroud like in the streaming category, and I will go ahead and say if you guys are in one of those positions where, Caleb Williams, your only quarterback, or you're in a super flex league or something, whatever, and you need a quarterback this week. I mean, Stroud sits at 59% rostered. It's a really good matchup against the Ravens. This defense is just absolutely god-awful, giving up the third most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. It's a great spot to be in, really, for every position, but for the quarterback position as well. So I think Stroud could come through with like 18 fantasy points like he did this past week. But if you guys follow this channel, you've known for some time that I just don't believe in CJ Stroud from a fantasy perspective. So he does make me nervous, but 2 touchdowns this past week, 233 passing yards, 11 yards on the ground, his best fantasy day yet. It is a road game, so bear that in mind. But I think for most of you guys in single quarterback formats, I'm not risking CJ Stroud. Desperation stream only. Dalton Schultz has 8.9 fantasy points in week 3, had 8 in week 4. Maybe a desperation streamer once again, just because he's playing the Ravens. But I think for a majority of you guys, he's just going to be a sit. I don't want to risk it in my starting lineup. And once again, what's the real ceiling there? It's very low. All right, Lamar Action Jackson could be out in week 5, dealing with that hamstring injury that kept him out for the end of that week 4 matchup against Kansas City. So we don't really know what's going on here, and I have a bad feeling we're not going to really know until we get much closer to Sunday. So obviously, if Lamar Jackson plays, I would still start him. I mean, I could understand wanting to sit him, but it depends on what you're going to sit him for. Like if you're worried about a re-aggravation of the injury, the Texans are a good team. In terms of fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks, they come in second overall. This is a stout defense. They have a good front seven. So bear that in mind. Bear in mind that there is the risk for re-injury, but I have a tough time not starting Lamar Jackson. In every game he's played in full health this year, he's at 26 or more fantasy points. So I'm just going to leave him as a start as long as he plays, but you guys could consider other options. When it comes to tight end position, I'm going to leave Mark Andrews in the start category. Once again, not a great matchup here, but this is a home game for the Ravens. If Cooper Rush gets to start, maybe I don't feel as confident in Mark Andrews, but he does have 10 or more fantasy points in the last 2 games, 6 or more catches in the last 2 games, and 2 touchdowns in that stretch as well. Isaiah Likely, worth paying attention to here, but he was on the field for 46% of snaps in week 4, 0 targets, 0 catches against the Chiefs last week, but he is back inactive, so keep that in mind and keep an eye on him, but he's just going to be a sit for now. Cooper Rush, like I said, if he plays or anything, like I'm not risking Cooper Rush in anyone's starting lineup in a bad matchup against the Texans if he gets the start here in week 5. All right, moving into the afternoon slate of games, we're going to have the Titans traveling to face the Cardinals. Cam Ward, just a sit. Has not been anything but a sit all year long for me. 5.2 or 5.52 fantasy points in week 4, 108 passing yards and a pick. Yeah. Well, yeah. There's nothing to discuss here. What was his quote after the game? We're ass. I don't even remember. I mean, yes, whatever it was, that is true. And he is going to be a strong sit on the road here against the Cardinals. Chicken Conco has just been a sit all year long. Like, I know he somewhat gets put in this streaming area conversation. He's not that for me. He's just a sit. I don't trust anyone in this passing attack for the Titans outside of like a very risky occasional Alec Manor at this point in the season. So I'm sitting Cam Ward, I'm sitting Chicken Conquo, and I don't think we need to discuss it any further than that. We look to Kyler Murray. I still have him as a streaming option. Maybe that's a bit harsh, but like Kyler Murray is 18 fantasy points in 2 games this year, 15 or less in the other 2. He threw 2 interceptions this past week against Seattle. It's a bit of a better matchup this week against the Titans, but not much better. They're ranking 10th against opposing quarterbacks, where Seattle is ranking 7th going into this coming week. So I think Kyler, I mean, if you have to start Kyler, sure. But you guys, if you own Kyler, you already know this. Like, you know that the ceiling's missing. You know that he's just a low-end start anyway. So he's in that streaming area for me. I just don't feel great about this offense or the play calling, even though it looked somewhat improved in week 4, and at least Marvin Harrison Jr. got involvement. I just never feel good about Kyler from a fantasy perspective unless he's just like playing a defense like the Cowboys or the Bears or something like that, the Bengals. Like I just don't feel good about him, and we'll leave it at that. I do, of course, feel good about Trey McBride. I think you start him no matter what. 12.1 or more fantasy points in every game this year. Had 11 targets, a season high this past week. Season high in receptions this past week at 7 as well. So if you own Trey McBride, there's no discussion here. He's as solid as it's going to come at the tight end position. Moving along, we'll have the Buccaneers traveling to face the Seahawks. Baker, Moneymaker, Mayfield still has been solid throughout the course of the year. 19.8 fantasy points in week 4 against the Eagles, 289 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, and an interception. I say you just keep rolling with Baker. I know the ceiling is not incredibly high. Not the greatest matchup here against the Seahawks on the road, but it looks like Baker can continue to just get things done regardless of what's going on at the wide receiver position or the running back position. I know we still have Mike Evans' status up in the air. Now we have Bucky Irving. His status is up in the air going into week 5. So keep an eye on those things. But I think Baker can get it done, whether he needs to scramble and run the football, whether he just needs to utilize Emeka Egbuka and Chris Godwin or Cade Otton or Rachaad White, whoever. I still believe in this offense. I'm not sneezing at this Seattle defense, but I think that Baker Mayfield is a solid start. We'll leave it at that. Cade Otton, I mean, like I just said, he could be utilized. You never know, but I'm not risking it in my starting lineup. He has done essentially nothing in terms of production on the season so far, so he is a sit. Then we look to Sam Darnold and company. I think Sam Darnold can just kind of live like in the streaming area, but like the lowest end of the streaming area, and it depends on the matchup, but the Hawks are at home. This is a good matchup. The Bucs have been bottom 10 against opposing quarterbacks, so like 16, 17, 18 fantasy points. I could see it. I mean, I will say this. Darnold is playing very good from a real-life football perspective. He's been very accurate. He's thrown at least a touchdown in the last 3 games, 2 touchdowns in 2 of the last 3 games. He's been good, don't get me wrong, but he just hasn't been good from a fantasy perspective. So I don't have a lot of confidence in him going into the week, but desperation streamer is fine. I just don't think that there's a very high ceiling. AJ Barner scored a touchdown this past week. He does have 10 or more fantasy points and 2 touchdowns in 2 of the 4 starts on the year so far. But I can't trust him from a fantasy perspective in your guys' starting lineups, even if you're absolutely desperate. Elijah Aroro also had some involvement this past week, but once again, just can't trust these Seattle Seahawks tight ends when it comes to fantasy football. All right, next up we will have the Lions traveling to face the Bengals. Jared Goff, what's going on here, man? We got a huge week 2 against the Bears. And then outside of that, 13 or less fantasy points in every game so far. But once again, like Goff's not playing bad by any means, but he just doesn't have the fantasy perspective. Threw a pick this past week against the Browns, but did throw 2 passing touchdowns, but only threw 168 passing yards. But all that being said, he gets the Bengals this week. It is a road game, so I guess there's that. But this Bengals defense, I mean, come on. Bo Nix just absolutely lit them up. They're going to continue to get worse and worse as this season progresses. They don't have an awful pass rush necessarily, but yeah, this is a good spot for Jared Goff. If it wasn't a good matchup, I maybe bump him down a bit here. But once again, I think this is a good spot. The opportunity for Goff to have a big game is absolutely there. So he is a solid start. May depend on who else is on your roster. Sam Laporta, I'm leaving him in the start category. Once again, because he's getting the Cincinnati Bengals, who are a bottom 5 unit against opposing tight ends in terms of fantasy points allowed. And I think Laporta is in that range of like, if you own them, you just got to roll with them. But we're getting pretty close to having a conversation about Sam Laporta, as he has had 7.3 or less fantasy points in 3 straight games. So I'll leave him as a start, but a low-end start. And it's only because he has this matchup against the Bengals. But this could definitely be one of those weeks where he absolutely pops off just due to the matchup. Jake Browning had 5 fantasy points this past week through no touchdowns, through no interceptions, didn't have any fumbles, but he only threw for 125 passing yards. And I think we can just leave it at that. I don't think it matters who he's playing, but also the Lions defenses look very opportunistic over the past 2 weeks or so. Not a good spot. We're not considering Browning anywhere in any format whatsoever. Mike Gesicki, Noah Fant, there's nothing here. Let's just move on to the next matchup. All right, the final matchup of the afternoon slate will be the Commanders traveling to face the Chargers. Let's go ahead and start with the Commanders side of things. At the time I am recording this, we don't know for sure that Jayden Daniels is going to play in Week 5, but all of the reports are indicating that he has a very strong chance and is likely to return in Week 5. So as long as JD5 plays, go ahead and roll with him. This is just a player you can't afford to bench. 19 or more fantasy points in each of his first 2 starts. We haven't seen like a crazy high ceiling out of Jayden Daniels. Maybe we get that in Week 6 at home against the Bears, or Week 7 on the road against the Cowboys. Good time to get Jayden Daniels back if you own him. But here in Week 5, he gets the Chargers. It's not a great matchup, but it's not a bad matchup. They're middle of the pack against opposing quarterbacks. As long as he's healthy, I think you can roll with him. Marcus Mariota would be a desperation streamer only, but I still don't really love him on the road against the Chargers. But if Mariota gets to start, like JD5 has a setback, desperation stream only. Although, let's give him some credit. He had 17 or more fantasy points in 2 straight games as a starter. He was solid, but I think it's going to be JD5 anyways. Zach Ertz, kind of in that area of like, you just roll with him if you own him. Top of the streaming category, but he sits at 74% rostered, so not too much of a streamer here, but 6.8 or less fantasy points in 2 straight games may have you a little worried after he had a touchdown in each of the first 2 games and 11.6 or more fantasy points in those 2 starts. But yeah, if he gets Jayden Daniels back this week, I think that definitely helps. Obviously, he is a good red zone or strong red zone target for JD5. That they have that chemistry. Tough matchup for Ertz. Not my favorite start this week in the lower end category of starts, but still definitely startable as we approach the week. Then we look to Justin Herbert and company. Herbie, fully loaded, has been not really a great quarterback the past 2 weeks when it comes to fantasy. This team is throwing the football at a ridiculous rate. I mean, he threw the football at least 41 times in the last 2 weeks, but has had 15.6 or less fantasy points through those 2 games. And he's also thrown 3 interceptions in the past 2 weeks. So we are missing a ceiling from Herbert, and we're really missing a floor as well. And this week he will get the Washington Commanders, which is a good matchup as this is a bottom 10 unit against opposing quarterbacks. The Chargers are at home, so I still like the spot for Herbert. I still think he's a good start this week. If we see a down week again here in Week 5 in terms of fantasy production, then we need to have a real conversation about Justin Herbert and maybe admit that he's really only a matchup-based quarterback. But I think it'll get better this week. I don't think there's much to worry about because, once again, this offense is throwing the football a ton. It's a Greg Roman offense, and I don't know what's happening to the run game, even though Amari Hampton has looked quite good the last 2 weeks. He's also getting really involved in the passing game. So, yeah, Herbert, we'll just leave him as a start. It's a good matchup. They're at home. I think it'll get better this week. Oronde Gadsden was the starting tight end in Week 4, as he was in Week 3 as well. But he just had 3 targets and 2 catches this past week. We saw no Will Dissly as he was out. Tyler Conklin is like fading into an abyss. And then Tucker Fisk is the only other tight end on this roster who had 1 target this past week. So worth keeping an eye on Gadsden. Don't know if Dissly's going to be back this week, but we don't need to start any of these guys when it comes to fantasy. Let's just go on to the next matchup. All right, moving along to Sunday Night Football. We're going to have the Patriots traveling to face the Bills. Let's start with Drake May and company. I like this spot a lot for Drake May this week. I've kind of viewed Drake May closer to like a streaming option, but I think at this point, we absolutely can't do that. He has to just be a start until further notice. This is a top 5 quarterback right now in fantasy, 20 or more fantasy points in 3 straight games. I know they're on the road here, so that's why I was still like maybe somewhat hesitant, but this is a good matchup. This Bills defense does not scare me. They're bottom 10 against opposing quarterbacks. You own Drake May, you got to feel good. 2 or more passing touchdowns in 3 straight games. 2 of those games, he also had a rushing touchdown. Good spot for him, even on the road. You own Drake May, just keep rolling with them. Hunter Henry, I think you just keep rolling with him as well. 3 touchdowns in the past 2 games. Once again, this Bills defense does not scare me. They do rank very high against opposing tight ends, but they still don't scare me, and Hunter Henry's going to get that involvement. He's the tight end 1 and half PPR, the tight end 3 and full PPR. Listen, there's always a chance that Hunter Henry does what he did in week 2 and gets you like 1 fantasy point. But also, I think for the most part, he's going to have a lot of these outings where he is just solid. Still has that red zone chemistry with Drake May, and just overall good chemistry with Hunter Henry, or with Drake May, I'm sorry. So if you own Hunter Henry, I think you can just roll with them and feel good about it. May depend on who else you guys have. Obviously, if you own Josh Allen, you're going to roll with them and feel good about it, especially at home against a divisional opponent. And this Patriots defense does not scare me whatsoever. So we don't need to break down Josh Allen. QB1 in fantasy, 25 fantasy points in week 4, 2 passing touchdowns. Did have a pick, but had 45 yards in the ground, a rushing touchdown, 209 passing yards. You own Josh Allen, you're starting him. All right, Dalton Kincaid. I think you own him, you're rolling with him as well. Once again, is maybe in this area of guys like Hunter Henry and Zach Ertz. Like, could depend on who else you have and everything. Kind of like a Dallas Goedert. Could be a bit touchdown dependent. But at the end of the day, this is the tight end 6 in full PPR, the tight end 2 in half PPR. He has 3 touchdowns in the first 4 games of the season. He only had 1 catch last week, but it was a touchdown. So he had 9.8 fantasy points this past week, right? So it was also only on the field for 37% of snaps in week 4, but I mean, they're playing the Saints. You know, they were pulling ahead pretty early there. So Kincaid still deserves to be rostered, as does Hunter Henry, maybe in a higher percentage of leagues, and is going to be a player that if you own him at tight end, you can always roll with them. There is some risk, but there's risk with everyone at the tight end position. Kincaid still a very solid start here in week 5 of the season. All right, last but not least, Monday Night Football. We're going to see the Chiefs travel to face the Jaguars. Let's start with Patty Mahomes and company. If you own Mahomes, just keep rolling with them. The QB3 right now in fantasy football. And the nice thing that we saw in week 4 was, like, through the first 2 weeks of the season, we had to see Mahomes, I guess you could argue through the first 3 weeks of the season, we had to see Mahomes, run and use his legs and score touchdowns on the ground to have fantasy production. We didn't see that in week 3, and he didn't have a great fantasy day, even in a good spot against the Giants. But this past week, we saw the Chiefs offense be fluent through the air as well and get basically every receiver on this team that was active involved. Juju Smith-Schuster, Hollywood Brown, Tyquan Thornton, and most importantly, Xavier Worthy, all heavy involvement this past week. And we even saw Travis Kelce also have a decent day with all that being said. And even, the running backs showed up to a degree. So, listen, that was at home against a very, very, very bad Ravens defense. This is on the road against a good Jaguars defense. This Jaguars defense is nothing to sneeze at. I've been talking about this for a few weeks now. So it could be a little bit different this week, but I do think this is going to be a game where the Chiefs are going to need to throw the football. You own Mahomes, just keep rolling with him. If you own Kelce, he's in that category too. Like, you own him, you just roll with what you get. You take the punches. Depends on who else you guys have on your roster. Like I said, 9.8 fantasy points in week 4, 5 targets, 5 catches, 48 receiving yards. Maybe not the craziest ceiling for Kelce on a weekly basis, but he is still definitely a very startable tight end. Not the greatest matchup, but you can keep rolling with Kelce if you own him. And we don't even need to talk about Noah Gray. His involvement on the season has been extremely porous. Then we look to the Jaguars. So you just can't feel good about Trevor Lawrence. He had a big game against the Bengals. Okay, that's it. 11.6 or less fantasy points in every other game so far on the season. You just can't feel good here. You can't. I mean, this is the Chiefs defense. This is a good defense. They're top 8 against opposing quarterbacks. There's nothing to like here in this matchup. This is also a good defense against opposing tight ends. So I put Brenton Strange in the sit category for that reason, but I will say, once again, especially with a few bye weeks looming around, if you guys need a streaming option at tight end, I think Brenton Strange actually okay, because he's had 10 or more fantasy points in 2 straight games and 6 catches in 2 straight games, as well as 7 targets in 2 straight games and at least 45 receiving yards. But it is a tough matchup. I do think this is going to be a game where the Jags are going to be forced to throw the football, as the Chiefs are a little bit better against the run. So ultimately, Brenton Strange still streamable, but I think for a lot of you guys, I don't really want to risk it. Just depends on what you guys have going on in the tight end position. And like I said, Trevor Lawrence, there's just not a lot to break down here. I just don't think he's a good start. I think most of you guys out there would agree with me as we move into week 5 of the season. And there you guys have it. Every single quarterback, every single tight end, every single matchup, who you guys should be starting, who you guys should be sitting here in week 5 of the fantasy season. Don't forget, guys, I'll answer as many fantasy football questions as I can in the comment section down below. So make sure if you guys need anything whatsoever moving into week 5, that you guys drop me a comment. I'll answer as many as I can as the week progresses. And while you guys are down there, it does me a huge favor and it helps the channel tremendously if you guys hit that subscribe button and that like button on the way out. And when the videos and playlists pop up on the screen, make sure you guys go check out all of our week 5 fantasy content. We have everything you guys could possibly need to dominate this week and every week of the fantasy season. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.